Hey, muy buenas tardes a todos. Volvemos otra vez con nuestro Global Azure en live, en vivo. Esta mañana hemos tenido un montón de sesiones, ayer por la tarde y hoy volvemos otra vez. Y esta vez tenemos una sesión muy interesante. Tenemos aquí a Sandro Pereira, que es MVP, que trabaja mucho con Azure, que viene de Portugal o está en Portugal y que nos va a hablar de Logic App, nos va a hablar de Logic App y estamos esperando a que nos cuente muchísimas cosas de Logic App. Cualquier cosa, cualquier pregunta, ponerla en el chat y yo se la paso a Sandro y le haremos cualquier pregunta y machacarlo a preguntas, soltar muchas preguntas que creo que nos interesan. Sandro, hello, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm going to speak in English because my Spanish is a
Yes,
little bad. No?
yeah, don't
I'm
worry, don't
fine,
worry.
thank you.
Don't worry
So,
about that. Yeah, I think the audience, we don't have any problem with the English, and if we have any problem, we can ask in the chat. We are going to here to help also with the translation if it's needed. But don't worry about your English. So we can start
okay,
with your session. I hope you have a good session. So let's go. Okay,
okay.
let's put
It,
your screen, and you can
awesome.
start when you like. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you for having me here. Another here. I've been there. I was lucky to be there in person a few years ago before the pandemic start. Again, I'm happy to be here online. I hope next year will be in person again. Let's see. First of all, thanks for our sponsors. Without them, it's kind of impossible to all of these amazing people to actually do these events. It takes a lot of time, effort. So thank you for all the sponsors of this event. And yes, my name is Sandro Pereira. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I'm being MVP for the last 10 years. I was a Beanstalk MVP, Integration MVP, and now I'm an Azure MVP. But my focus is on enterprise integration, working on premise with a Beanstalk server or in the cloud using Azure Integration Service, API management, logic apps, apping, service bus, functions, well, all of these several pieces of enterprise integration that we can find on Azure. I'm the head of integration at DevScope, a consulting company in Portugal. You have my email address, my LinkedIn profile, blog. Feel free to reach me out. Any questions offline, any comments? Well, I'm happy to connect with you and help in any way it can be possible. So my session is about logic app, best practice, tips and tricks. And the first tip that I have today is do not forget the previous tips that I was talking last year, and to recap all of them is kind of logic app naming convention. You should have good naming convention to give to your logic app um, flows, okay? Your business process. I'm meaning the name, the exact name of the logic app. And the reason why is that it's readable, you can read better what specific logic app is trying to achieve. It transfers knowledge between the teams and so on and so forth. So and the same happens to the actions inside the logic app, the name of the actions. No, I normally say that if you are a C# developer and you start creating a code with bar one, bar two, function one, function two, sorry, you will be fired in a week or so from your job. No, no one allows you to do that. It's, well, doesn't make sense. Okay? You have to give good variable names. You have to give good function name, classes, and so on and so forth. Well, it's our daily day job. It's kind of mandatory. So why to do not to do the same in the logic apps. And by giving actions a good name, you actually provide better readability on that. You don't need to enter in each shape to understand what is trying to achieve. No, so it's important to have, and you have kind of 255 characters that you can set up that name. So give a good name. No, add comments. It's important to add comments. We do it often also in the C sharp wall. We do a comment on the function saying what this function is doing. In several parts of the code, we comment saying I'm doing this or that. So uh, comments serve for that. In the same logic applies on the logic app. No, um, in some cases, I say that all shapes should have a comment, but at least the most important ones. Some triggers don't allow you to change the name. For example, the web, when the HTTP request is received, we can, we should put a comment there. Who is delivering that message? What is receiving that shape, and so on and so forth. No, we have scopes that collapse certain areas of the our logic app. Well, it's a good place also for you to put a comment saying this zone, this section is doing that, that, and that. No, so add comments to your logic app flow. The scopes and what is the purpose of a scope. So the scope has at least two functions. It's a region that we can collapse. So our logic app can get bigger and large. So we create scopes to collapse certain areas of the region and for us to focus on the important area that we are working and avoid a lot of scrolling. But they also serve as a try catch or a try catch finally mechanism, for us to implement this type of error handling, that is kind of the next step. We need a try catch or try catch finally, and we do that with configuration of different scopes and run after settings. No, and we speak also about each connector as retry policies that you can specify. These all are out of the box capabilities that you can use to kind of control your errors and failures and so on. Learn from failures. Exactly. No, it's failure is critical, and we need to analyze why it's failing. Well, failures will always happen. No, we need to handle that in a good way. But sometimes there are failures because we didn't control specific situations of our flow, our business flow. We need to learn for that, control that situation, and be prepared to handle that situations. In some cases, it's not a failure. In some cases, can be a failure that we need to retry later on, and so on and so forth. So we need to learn. We need to go to the run history, analyze from time to time, and check why it's failing, what we can improve, and so on. Expression nightmare. Why expression nightmare? So if you are familiar with the logic app designer, no matter if it's standard or consumption, uh, if and expressions are functions that we can use, they are internal on the engine, kind of manipulate strings and so on. If you go to that editor, you find a small text box that you cannot read nothing inside that because it's so small, it's not resizable. And you have to use OneNote to create um, complex expressions, no, and then pass it inside that small text editor. Um, there is no better way at the moment, my friends. For example, Power Automate as a new expression designer, which is awesome. It's just a big windows. You can indent your expression. Unfortunately, you still need to wait for the Logic App team to put the similar capabilities in our Logic App designer. Um, Control your connectors or API connections. No, this is kind of the weak point of our Logic Apps because most connectors can break. For example, if you don't use the Office 365 connectors for a long time, the token will expire, but you never know until there is an execution. So we need to find a good ways to control and monitoring these API connections. We create a lot of noise in our subscriptions. No, we kind of start creating, we delete, we create again, and sometimes there are orphan resources that they are trash, they are not being used. And API connections is one of them. Even if you are kind of creating, for example, a SQL API connection, and you fail your credential, there is a failure, it creates a SQL one behind the scenes. And then you try to create again, it creates a SQL two. That means that SQL one is orphaned. No one is using that. So we should clean that situation, because it's not important for our developer. We don't care in production is running, everything is fine, but the people that are doing governance with your Azure subscriptions, they are maintaining and supporting, they will be the nightmare. So you also need to think about these kind of situations. And a lot, again, some they are orphan, some they can be broken, and we need to fix that. But we have to, instead of be reactive to problems, we need to be more able. And if we find a way to know these connections are broken and fix that earlier than the executions, even better. So we actually have to have the good monitoring policies behind the scenes. No, so this was the last tips that I was kind of speaking in the last years. Now let's have a new ones, and we maintain the naming convention, and this time the connectors, the API connections naming conventions. No, why? Again, the same reason. By default, um, once you create the API connection from your Logic App Designer, it creates SQL 1, um, OneDrive 1, Service 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. This is this is nonsense. This is the same of creating var 1, var 2, var 3. And I give that feedback several times to Microsoft. This is a nonsense that has to stop. We have to give a good name to our connections. Okay, it improves readability. Well, who is using that? So what that SQL connection? Okay, it's a SQL connection. I know that it's using to a SQL, but what SQL? It's a dev, it's a Q&A. Well, all of this stuff. No, if you kind of give a good name, you don't need to go and enter in each connector to see what is actually the connector that we are trying to use or configure. No, and that is important once you have a lot of resources. No, well, it's possible to do it in Visual Studio, not exactly on the portal directly, because the Logic App Designer doesn't allow us to do that. But we can always go to the Azure Portal. We get the SQL one, we export a template, we give a good name, and import the template again. But doing that manually process, you have to know that we need to go back to our Logic apps and change the connector, not use the SQL one, but the connection equals as the expenses, because we are actually creating a new API connection. But we then later can delete the SQL one. This is by the Azure portal. Luckily for us, we can do CI/CD, or we can change that connection name behind the scenes on the Visual Studio. And we don't need this manually kind of process. Depending on the editor that you are using, you have several ways to do that. Okay, but as you see, it's better for me to have this CN, that means connection, SQL, as the expenses. At least I know that I'm using a connector for the SQL, and this is SQL database that I have for a product that is smart documented expenses. Okay, it makes sense for me. But if I add this equal one, well, I don't know what is equal one, what I'm trying to achieve that. Okay, so that's the point of having a good naming convention also for your API connections. No? Again, using the Visual Studio, we can go to our JSON and also the parameters for the deployment, but we can go and we add kind of two names there, the name and the display name. The name is actually the name of the connector, this that you see on that list on the Azure portal. This is the name. And the display name is normally what you see inside our logic apps. No? You see the display name, not the name. So we can actually change that directly on Visual Studio and deploy it again. It will create that API connections with a good naming convention, and awesome. Okay. Uh, so Microsoft released 1 year ago, probably more or less, a new type of logic app. It was called Preview, Logic App Preview. Now it's called Logic App Standard. And the existing one that was called Logic App is now Logic App Consumption. So what is this difference between Logic App Consumption, and so on and so forth? No? Well, Logic App Consumption is the original Logic Apps. The first Logic App that appears on the Azure portal is 100% serverless. Okay, it has a serverless engine. Microsoft control everything. You create your business flow, your Logic App business flow for integrate to enterprise integration, B2B integration, whatever you need. Uh, and if you want a more um, performance environment, you can choose to have an integration service environment, a HICE environment. And this is a dedicated environment for you to run your logic apps. And you get better throughput, less limitations, because, well, it's a serverless, a serverless service. So you have to be careful that because it's shared by the if you are not using an ICE, this environment is shared by a lot of customers. So yeah, you are is more strict. So if you want better capabilities, you can go to the ICE. It's fully isolated, dedicated for you, and you can do a lot of things. It's a bit a little expensive, but yeah, for big companies, it's awesome. The Logic App standard is not serverless, is a computed-based Logic App. Can deploy to app service hosting plan in Azure or a Docker container. It virtually runs everywhere. Okay, so Logic Apps runs only on the cloud. This Logic App standard runs everywhere. It's a Docker, Azure plan inside in my machine, running locally in my machine. It runs everywhere. It runs inside on top of the Azure functional runtime. So it's a different runtime. It actually, you have two types of workflows that you can build, your business flows, stateless and stateful. This is something new, okay? The Logic App Consumption basically is a stateful workflow in by design, no? So stateful workflows is the equivalent of the Logic App Consumption. It kind of capture all the steps. You have this run history, everything tracked, so it's good. The stateless is more for performance, that we need to achieve a quick response time, high throughput, and we don't short runs, try and forget kind of request response that we need fast stuff. and you can create this stateless workflow. It doesn't persist and save all of the data, so it's quite fast, and it's a little fast. Okay, quite. It's a little fast than the stateful workflows. Okay. Uh, so by design, the difference is that well, when we are in the Azure portal, we create an Azure resource and we create a resource called a logic app. We actually create our business flows, and each logic app consumption is a business process. And inside of that resource group, you can create other type of resource like API management, service bus, key vaults, you name it. Okay. The logic app standard is different. Okay, when you create an Azure resource and we add a logic app standard, we are creating a container of workflows. Okay, and these workflows can be stateless or stateful. Again, logic app standard that you see their preview, because it's old. I forgot to change that shape. The logic app standard runs on top of the Azure function. And if you think about the Azure function, you create as Azure function resource. It creates your container of functions, and then you create several functions inside that. This is the same. So we create a logic app standard, and inside that resource, we create several workflows, stateless or stateful. And on the same resource group, you can add multiple logic app standards, and inside that logic app standards, several workflows. Okay, so this is kind of the difference between them. Again, logic app standard runs on top of Azure function, so it basically says that you can run everywhere. It means in Kubernetes, in Azure Portal. It can also run inside other cloud providers if you want. Okay, so, and even again, it runs on my machine. I have my function runtime installed on my computer. I can start creating my logic app standards and run locally, debug locally, and then deploy for wherever I want. Okay. With all of these logic app standard consumption, what is the best developer tool? What are the tools exist, and what is the best for each case? Unfortunately, there is no good answer for that. So we have the Azure portal. It serves for you to create logic app standards, logic app consumption. It's a quick approach, special for the consumption. Almost of the tutorials are based on the Azure portal itself. It's more performance, so the browser is faster than the embedded Internet Explorer inside the Visual Studio. It has faster updates, but using the Azure portal, there is a lack of proper CI/CD. Naming convention is a little limit, especially on the API connections. There is lack of source resource repo, and it's hard to customize some parameters of our logic app. So I said it serves for beginning, for small stuff, for POC stuff, not for enterprise scenarios, and special not for scenarios that we have kind of dev, Q&A, prod, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you are on that level, you will never use the Azure portal. Okay, and then there is Visual Studio, our main tool for developers. No, I like Visual Studio. I'm familiar with that, so I'm working on that for several years. So it's my tool, my favorite tool. No, it has full CI/CD support, proper naming convention. I know that tool from inside out. Source code is not a problem. I can do it everywhere I want. So I have everything there. But there is also problems. No, nowadays not only developers start creating logic apps and so on. So Visual Studio requires a license. Okay, there are some well-known bugs with the extension, the plugin for Logic App. If the Logic App reach a such amount of shapes, you cannot use the Visual Studio anymore. So that's a bug. No, it has no support for Logic App standard, and I mean no support at all. We cannot create a Logic App standard using Visual Studio. So if you are using consumption, yeah, this is one of the best tools to use. If you use standard, we can't. That means that we have also Visual Studio Code, no? It's free. Everyone can use it. You don't require a license. You have full support for Logic App Standard. You have a full new Logic App Designer, local project support, breaking points. We actually can do breaking points in your business flow, uh, limit support, debug, but it is a debug. But we have limit support for consumption. When I mean limit is that there is no Logic App Designer at all. It's just only view mode. You cannot do any change by the designer. You have to do everything from the scratch using the JSON. Man, I'm old. My brain needs to focus in other important stuff. I have kids at home that I also need to dedicate my time. So I'm not going to build a Logic app by the scratch, everything by hand, just because it doesn't have an editor. I prefer to use the Visual Studio or the Portal. It has an editor at least, no? So it's a no-go for me to consumption. Is a go for the standard because it's the only option at the moment, except the Azure Portal. But the Azure Portal doesn't have a proper CI/CD. So yeah, so we are bound in these three situations: Logic App consumption, Visual Studio, Logic App Standard, Visual Studio Code, and Azure Portal for POCs and some cases also to developer. But well, then we have to extract and prepare that information for CI/CD and do all of this stuff. I know some of the cases that we use it this way because the logic app is quite big that we cannot do any change on the Visual Studio because it's not kind of it doesn't respond at all. So yeah, not we are lacking a good tool for developing all of this stuff. And I'm not speaking about if you are working with XML and you need to create XSLT, then you have to use Visual Studio, I think 2005, because he has a mapper, liquid template, kind of do it manually. So we are still, yeah, not good in terms of developing tools, okay? But it is what it is at the moment. Implement a good governance policies from day one. This is important for me. I learned that for in the hard way in some cases. No, for example, I had a client. We have a logic app for notifying problems. Luckily for us, we didn't have any problems or too much problems. Unfortunately, on the day that we had a problem, the API connections were broke because the token has expired, because no usage, so the token expired. We learned that in the bad way. So we kind of implement a monitoring policy that is looking to all of our API connections, check the status, and then notify us saying, well, these connections are broke, or if we don't receive nothing, we don't have any problems at all. But we had to implement this kind of monitoring because there are nothing in kind of in out of the box that allow us to to have this information. Okay. Um, so yeah, and also case of documentation and governance, there is no good way for us to know which logic apps are using which kind of connectors. No, if you have a lot of logic apps on the same resource group, logic app, a lot of API connections, we it's difficult for us, almost impossible, without spending a lot of hours, kind of correlating which logic app are using which kind of connectors. No, or we are lucky and from day one we have a good documentation that I don't believe that people and clients will have. So I then end up kind of resolving all of these situations using PowerShell and using the REST APIs available on the Azure. Uh, and this basically, I create a PowerShell that goes to all my resource groups inside a subscription. It list all the connectors available. It kind of correlate which logic app is using which connectors. So for example, you see that general notifications is using Office 365 BTS monitor and Teams BTS monitor, these two kind of connectors. All others are using the SQL connector, but in a simple way, the quick way, because that takes me kind of 5 minutes to run all of this script, depending on the size of resources you have on your subscriptions, of course. But I get all of this information in a dynamic way that I can use it for documenting. And I also can say that by doing that, find all of these orphan connections, say that, hey, SQL 1, SQL 2, SQL 3, SQL 4, no one is using. You can go there and delete it. They are noise that is causing noise in your resource group, in your subscription. So go ahead and delete it, safe. No one is using that. And you can do a lot of these things about logic apps not running for a long time. So are they deprecated just because they are supposed not to run? But it's also important to understand that because, well, I know that sometimes we have a lot of logic apps that when we ask the developer team saying, what is this, what is doing? Or that one is already deprecated. We ship to a new one. It's deprecated. So what is doing there? Because we normally deploy new stuff to production, but we do not deprecate right away. We don't delete right away the resource or the old ones because, well, something fails, we have a rollback situation, no? But we forgot to clean that resources. So it's important for us to understand and have this overview inside our subscriptions, our resource groups. Get the error message also. So errors happens, and we have to log this error for a system, notify someone. So how is the good way to get a clear error message? And if you are a C# developer, well, you can do a try catch. That is the exception, and we can exception dot message, and we have the error message, and we log to event viewer, the SQL, whatever you want. No, how can we do the same in the Logic app? Michael Stefan is a good friend of mine. Create a strategy using the try catch and a function to get a clear error message. Is a good approach. Well, I was trying to get a simplified way to do that, and I found that using a conjugation of two shapes, we can do the same or kind of identical. So we have these, we can add a filter array, and we place the result of the try scope that is just above, and we use a filter that array. No, we go to the item, status item of that array, finding what is equal to failed, and if it will get the failing because, well, it happens to fail, that's for sure, because we are in the catch. We need to find at least one. And then I use a variable to get the first output of that filter array. That gives me a JSON with the status code 500, whatever, and then there is the body that is the error message inside that. I can log that payload, JSON payload, or I can actually go to the body, that error message, and get that in an easy way. So we don't need any external code functions to actually get this good error message information, okay? And I told well, the Azure portal doesn't have a proper CI/CD, okay? And that's true, it doesn't have, but it has versions, okay? So every time that we change, and this is for when we are developing the portal, no? Because if you have the repo, we can actually go and grab the previous version and deploy it again. It's simple. But when you are working on the Azure portal, we don't have a proper source code, but we have these kind of versions. We can go, all the saves that you do on the portal, it goes and stays that version. It creates a new version of the Logic app. So we can go to a previous one and actually say promote and promote to production. So we are hold back, in this case, 3 versions. This works fine, but remember, one important tip: if you move this Logic app from a different resource, you lose all of these version history. You broke all of them, okay? Because this version history has the name of the resource group and so on and so forth, IDs and so on. And if you move to another one, it stays the old IDs. So you will break all of these versioning and you cannot hold back anymore, okay? So remember that before you move your resource to a different resource group. Another tip, it's about using HTTP methods. I see a lot of people using the HTTP receive only with posts because its default operations is the post. So they think even if you want a get, you need to do a post for the Logic app, and that's not true. You can actually implement a good best practice on REST APIs and use all the methods: the get, the post, the put, the delete. You can do it everything, okay? And for example, on the get operation, you have kind of 2 types of sending information on the get operation. You can use URI parameters. That means that all the parameters are passing in the URL, are part of the URL. And for that, you need to kind of add a new parameter, and you select relative path, and you see that on that relative path I have first name, I have the token F name, and I have the last name and the token last name. And I can use that later on the previous on the upcoming actions. The good about using the URI parameters is that they are automatically tokenized. So if I want to add it here, the tokens will appear. I'm just selecting the properties from that receive trigger, okay? But you also use the query parameters. And the query parameters, you are not specifying nothing because you had it to the end of the URL. As you see here, the F name, Sandro, and last name, Pereira. So there is no easy way to get that, but we can go to the triggers output, the queries record, and select the query that you want, the last name or the first name. So you need to build an expression to do that, but you also can access that information inside your Logic apps. So the Logic app accepts all type of HTTP methods, and you can use according to good REST best practice. No? Um, then we have this for each parallelism. We are almost ending. It's important for you to understand what is for each parallelism or this concurrency control. So if you are running inside the for each, by default, you have a concurrency degree of parallelism. I don't know if it's 20 or so, but that is by default you are executing the for each in parallel, different actions in parallel. That can cause problems. If you, especially if you are connecting to end systems that are more legacies and doesn't support too much connections, you can break and give some timeouts and so on and so forth. Uh, you have to understand that this the way you control that is by going to the for each concurrency control and kind of reduce the degree of parallelism or just disable and you go in the sequence mode. The problem with the sequence mode is for example, if you have kind of 100 records, it will probably take 4 minutes to process all of these recursive inside your process. So it's important to want you to understand that there is this option and you can go there and optimize according to your needs. And again, I think this is the last one. Yes, 10 tips is the last one. We are almost reached the time limit also. Uh, Protect our API, our logic apps. No, we create a lot of logic apps, but you also need to understand how to protect these logic apps. One way, for example, is not to expose directly the logic app to the outsiders. No, you can expose that logic app on API management if it's, of course, HTTP. If it's a service bus trigger, you don't need to worry about that because it's already kind of protected. But if it's a HTTP, well, exposing directly, giving that strange URL can cause problems. So you can use API management to to be your kind of front door. And for example, restrict the IP address from that logic app, accepting only requests from the API management itself. Um, you can use Active Directory Open Authentication. You can secure the data run history by obfuscation. And this is important because sometimes you need to keep secrets. Let's say we want to connect to a HTTP, but we need to send user and passwords, all of this stuff. No, sometimes you need to read that information that normally is on the keyboard because it's a safe place. But if you don't create this obfuscation, if you do not enable this obfuscation, everyone that has access to the run history will see the password and the username that will become insecure by nature. So these kind of shapes should you should enable the obfuscation. Do not allow anyone to see what is coming from there. No. Uh, you can also use airbag policies for contributor and operation or for this kind of security. I have a set of blog posts about how you can expose a logic app through the API management, several logic apps in the same API, and so on and so forth. How you can actually restrict the logic app from the IP address from the API management. So can go ahead and look for that. You just need to understand there are a lot of ways you can protect your logic apps. And with that, I finish my presentation. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you like some of the stuff. Well, if you have any questions, just type there, and otherwise send me an email, and I will try to respond as soon as possible.
Thank you, Sandro. Good stuff, a lot of tips and good tricks. So good stuff. And
Thank you.
right now we don't have any questions. Si tenéis alguna pregunta, aprovechar ahora el momento. Sandro, we have my own question for you
Sure.
about the tools. You talk about Visual Studio. You talk about how to edit in using the portal, using Visual Studio Code. What's the best tool?
Depending
I
what you're
know it
doing.
depends. Yeah, I know it depends.
So, normally, what I'm using is I use Visual Studio for Launch Cap consumption. That's
Okay.
my main tool for consumption. For standard is Visual Studio Code, and if I want to do some quick POCs, well, I'm going to the portal because it's quite fast. That's my kind of three rules. Uh, Other times, if I want to create some XSLTs and so on, luckily I have bespoke environments that I use the editor to create the
Yeah.
XSLT, so I don't have any problems. But we have all tools that we need to. There is a mapper, a logic app, XML mapper, XSLT mapper, but you have to use a whole version of Visual Studio. And well, I don't want to install different Visual Studios in my computer because it's a heavy program. So, well, again, I'm speaking a lot with Microsoft product group about this and the annoying that the situation is because well, you have amazing features that we can use, but we are lacking a good developer experience.
Yeah.
And some of this stuff has a lot of time consuming doing that because it could be simple in a simple way if you have the tools that we need. I hope in the future they will improve that. I know that they will improve the I don't know when, but let's see.
Okay. Yeah, maybe right now we need to move maybe the Visual Studio editor to the Visual Studio Code, so we are going to have consumption and standard in the
I'm
same in the
I'm
same editor.
I understand. I don't like the honestly, my opinion. Well, I'm not kind of familiarized with the Visual Studio Code.
No,
I don't like the having a folder for the solution.
yeah, running inside as a function. You don't like this.
That's kind of
I
you need to
prefer this approach.
create a folder for having your project, different folders, local
Yeah,
folders. Yours. I prefer to have a solution. That's it. It's a solution. That's why I like the Visual Studio itself. No, and I think in terms of editor, it's more powerful at the moment than the code. But I understand the code. It's free. No, it's a lightweight. Uh,
yes, it's more light. I think it's more easy to create a logic app inside Visual Studio Code and inside Visual Studio. But I know your point of view. I
yeah.
know that Visual Studio is a better reader, and I know that we need to choose. Maybe we need to have both. We need to have both to choose whether when you
I,
want.
I, I think the goal it is because I think developers will always do Visual Studio and it's a licensed product. So if you are paying for that, well, come on, you have to have the tools, no?
Yeah,
So
yes, of course.
we are paying for that situation, no? Uh, I know that later on we can have the Visual Studio Code, but I get, at the moment Microsoft is saying that kind of everything goes to the code and forget about Visual Studio. It seems like Visual Studio is just to developer C sharp,
Yeah,
you know, and it's not. It shouldn't be that way, no. But yeah, I know that we have the API management on the Visual Studio Code. We have Logic App on the Visual Studio Code. Well, I like the Visual Studio Code for small stuff, but well,
yeah, but
I'm,
not for serious project or for enterprise project.
yeah, I'm still
Yeah,
an old guy going my solution. I like to have my solution. Click on that and appears all my solution. I'm still get a little confused about, well, my folder. I need to have a folder.
Yes, of course. It's something like programming in Java. That is a we have
Yes.
a folder, we have namespace folder. We don't have the solution concept yet. I know.
Yeah, if you are a web developer, you probably say that. Well, that makes sense. No, from me, it doesn't make that much sense. But yeah, it is what it is. But neither the other are perfect at the moment. CI/CD, in some cases, even CI/CD is a problem. It's a nightmare. Time-consuming task. I think Microsoft should dedicate more about this and simplify this process. Uh, let's see. Let's see.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandro, for having here. It's a pleasure to have you talking about Logic App. So thank you, and hope we can see in a
Uh,
future, in a near future,
exactly.
in person. Yeah.
Okay. See you. See you guys. Bye.